Hey guys, tonight we are stepping out into the thin, cold air of 1920s Manhattan, where the ground is a distant memory, and the only thing between you and the afterlife is an 8-inch wide steel girder. Imagine the taste of coal smoke and sea salt on your tongue as you balance hundreds of feet above the taxicabs, watching the morning fog roll off the Hudson River like a slow-moving ghost. The city below is a frantic, buzzing hive, but up here, it's just you, the wind, and the rhythmic clanging of hammers echoing against the sky. You probably won't survive the sheer vertigo of this, mostly because the concept of OSHA hasn't been invented yet, and your primary safety equipment is basically just a good sense of balance and a flat cap. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a massive I-beam that feels surprisingly solid, yet terrifyingly narrow. It's early 1929, and New York is currently obsessed with touching the clouds. Personally, I've always found it a bit ironic that humans spend thousands of years perfecting the art of staying on the ground, only to suddenly decide that living in a 60-story filing cabinet is the ultimate goal. You look down, and the people on the sidewalk look like ants. Not even the interesting, hard-working ants, but the tiny, confused ones that wander around a spilled soda. This is the vertical frontier. It's a mainstream historical fact that during the skyscraper boom of the late 1920s, buildings like the Chrysler and the Empire State were rising at an unbelievable rate of 4 or 5 floors a week. You can almost feel the city stretching upward, like a giant yawning after a long sleep. The wind up here has a personality. It's not just a breeze, it's a persistent, nagging shove that wants to know why you're invading its space. I think there's a specific kind of madness required to do this for a living. You aren't wearing a harness. No one is. In fact, if you showed up to a job site in 1925 asking for a safety line, the other guys would probably think you were trying to start a circus act. A quirky tidbit of the era is that some ironworkers actually preferred to work in leather-soled shoes because they claimed they could feel the steel better under their feet, which sounds like the kind of logic I use when I say I don't need a map because I know the vibes of the city. Historians still argue whether the lack of safety equipment was a result of corporate greed or if the workers themselves fostered a culture of bravado that viewed safety as a sign of weakness. Personally, I lean toward the latter. There's something undeniably poetic, if deeply misguided, about the way you stand there, hands in your pockets, watching a tugboat crawl through the harbor. You see the skeleton of the building surrounding you, a web of dark, rusted orange steel that will soon be covered in limestone and Art Deco trimmings. It's a skeleton that demands to be put together with fire and noise. You aren't just a spectator, you're part of a rivet gang, and your day is about to get very loud. I've always felt that the 1920s skyline was a giant puzzle, but instead of cardboard pieces, you're using 3-inch cylinders of red-hot carbon steel. The air smells of the forge, a sharp, acrid scent of coke and sulfur that sticks to the back of your throat. It's a smell that belongs in a blacksmith's shop from the Middle Ages, yet here it is, floating 300 feet above 42nd Street. I find it relatable that even in this high-tech age of wireless telegrams and jazz records, the fundamental way we hold the world together is still essentially hit it with a hammer until it stays. You watch your foreman check a blueprint that looks more like a suggestion than a set of rules. He's a man whose face looks like it was carved out of a dry piece of hickory, and he doesn't look like he's ever had a full night's sleep in his life. You find a spot to sit on a girder that's still cold from the night air. The sun is starting to catch the Chrysler Building's spire in the distance, turning it into a needle of pure light. It's beautiful, sure, but it's also a reminder of the competition. Everyone is racing. I think the most relatable thing about this era isn't the glamour of the Great Gatsby. It's the frantic, sweaty hustle of people trying to build something bigger than themselves before the money runs out. You can hear the first few whistles blowing from the factories across the river. The boring USA is waking up, and it's about to start screaming in the key of pneumatic drills. As you sit there, you notice a pigeon landing on the beam just a few feet away. It looks at you with that blank, judgmental bird stare, as if to say, "I have wings. What's your excuse?" Honestly, I've always suspected that birds in New York think we're the most hilarious species on the planet, climbing up here just to stand around on metal sticks. You give the bird a little nod, and it flutters away, leaving you alone with the hum of the wind. You can feel the vibration of the city rising up through the steel, the subway trains deep underground, sending their tremors all the way to the sky. It's a rhythmic, steady pulse. I find it fascinating that historians still argue whether the skyscraper race was actually a viable economic move or just a massive ego trip for the titans of industry. To you, it doesn't really matter. You're just here for the $15 a day, which, in 1929, felt like a king's ransom, provided you lived long enough to spend it at the speakeasy on Friday night. You adjust your heavy leather gloves, feeling the thickness of the material. They're stained with grease and bits of slag, a physical record of every floor you've helped raise. The clouds are beginning to break, revealing patches of a surprisingly bright blue sky. It's a moment of peace before the chaos begins. I think there's a certain zen to being this high up. The noise of the traffic is muffled. The smells of the street are gone. And you're in a world of pure geometry. But then, you hear the rattle of the coal being shoveled into the forge. The fire is being lit. The day of the flaming baseballs is about to begin, and you need to be ready. You stand up, feeling that familiar slight sway of the building. It's not much, just a few inches of movement to account for the wind, but it's enough to remind you that the skyscraper is alive. The quiet of the morning is officially over as the rest of your four-man rivet gang arrives on the platform. It's a group that operates with the unspoken telepathy of a veteran jazz quartet, though the music they're about to play is significantly more industrial. I've always found it interesting how humans in high-stress jobs stop using words and start using a language of grunts, nods, and eyebrow twitches. You're standing there among them, and you realize that if any one of these three guys has a bad day or a momentary lapse in focus, your Friday night plans are effectively canceled permanently. It's a mainstream historical fact that a rivet gang consisted of four distinct roles: the heater, the catcher, the bucker-up, and the gunman. You aren't just co-workers. You are a single biological machine designed to turn loose beams into a monolithic spine of steel. First, you look at the heater, often called the cook. He's the guy standing over the portable coal forge. Personally, I think he has the most stressful job because he's playing a high-stakes game of the floor is lava all day. He's the one who decides when a rivet is ready. And in the 1920s, ready meant a very specific shade of glowing orange-red. If it's too cold, it won't deform. If it's too hot, it becomes brittle and loses its structural integrity. It's a quirky tidbit that a skilled heater could tell the temperature of the steel within a few degrees just by looking at the color of the glow. A skill that feels like a superpower to those of us who can't even tell if a chicken breast is done without a digital thermometer. Then there's the catcher. That's you today. Or at least you're standing right next to him. The catcher stands on a narrow plank, often hundreds of feet away from the forge, holding nothing but a battered, soot-stained tin bucket. I've always felt that catcher is a bit of an understatement. Suicide shortstop seems more accurate. Historians still argue whether the catcher's role was the most dangerous due to the precarious positioning, or if the sheer repetitive strain of catching heavy projectiles while balanced on a toothpick was the real killer. You watch him adjust his stance, his feet finding the sweet spot on a wooden board that looks far too thin to support a man's confidence. Behind the beam waits the bucker-up. He's the muscle. His job is to take a massive steel bar, called a dolly bar, and brace it against the head of the red-hot rivet once it's been shoved through the hole. I find it relatable that the bucker-up is usually the quietest guy in the gang, mostly because his brain is being rattled around in his skull like a marble in a spray paint can for 8 hours a day. He has to lean his entire body weight against that bar to resist the force of the pneumatic hammer on the other side. It's a brutal, physical grind that makes a modern gym workout look like a spa day. Finally, there's the gunman. He's the one who actually drives the rivet home with a pneumatic hammer, the gun. He's the conductor of this noisy orchestra. When the gunman pulls the trigger, the staccato rat-tat-tat-tat can be heard from 10 blocks away. Personally, I've always thought the gunman gets all the glory. But he's also the one most likely to lose his hearing by the age of 30. You watch him oil his machine, the dark liquid dripping onto the steel beam. There's a strange, greasy beauty to the tools of this trade. They're heavy, honest, and completely unforgiving. I think the most fascinating thing about this gang is the cultural melting pot it represents. You see men from the Mohawk Nation working alongside Irish immigrants and kids from Brooklyn farms. It was a hierarchy of skill, not birth. If you could catch a flaming rivet at 800 feet, no one cared where your grandfather was born. I find it relatable that even in a decade known for intense social friction, the high steel was a place where not dying was a powerful incentive for mutual respect. You look at the heater as he begins to pump the bellows. The charcoal starts to glow, a deep, angry crimson that fights against the pale morning sun. You notice the heater glancing your way. He's picking up a long pair of tongs. This is the moment where the boring USA stops being boring and starts being a projectile sport. I've always found it funny how we think of logistics today as barcodes and tracking numbers. In 1924, logistics was a man named Murphy throwing a 3/4-inch piece of glowing metal 60 feet through a crosswind, hoping his buddy didn't have a sneezing fit. You feel the heat radiating from the forge, even from your distance. It's a dry, biting heat that smells like the very foundation of the Industrial Revolution. The gunman gives a sharp whistle. He's ready. The bucker-up shifts his dolly bar into position, his knuckles white against the dark metal. You take a deep breath, and your lungs feel the thinness of the altitude. I think there's a specific kind of adrenaline that comes from knowing you're about to participate in a ritual that hasn't changed since the first skyscraper went up. It's a rhythm, a cycle. Heat, toss, catch, buck, drive. Repeat until the skyline is changed. You realize that the entire city of New York is held together by these tiny, hidden junctions, each one a testament to 4 guys who didn't look down. Historians still argue whether the rivet gangs were paid enough for the risk, but as you watch the heater lift a glowing rivet from the coals, the economics of the situation fade away. All that matters is the trajectory. I've always felt that the most authentic part of history isn't the dates in the books, but the sweat on a man's brow and the way he narrowed his eyes against the glare of the sun. You grip the handle of your tin bucket a little tighter. The metal is cold, but the air is about to get very, very hot. The heater takes a practice swing with his tongs, a casual gesture that belies the lethality of the object he's holding. You realize that you're part of a lineage of roughnecks who built the modern world while gravity was constantly trying to pull them back to the 19th century. I find it relatable that despite the epic scale of the building, the actual work is small, intimate, and repetitive. It's just one rivet, then another, then 10,000 more. You square your shoulders, finding your balance on the beam, and nod toward the forge. The first flaming baseball of the day is about to fly. The air around the heater's forge is a shimmering, distorted curtain of heat that makes the distant Woolworth building look like it's underwater. You're standing close enough to the forge now to feel the moisture being sucked right out of your skin. Personally, I think the heater's job is the most psychologically taxing because he's essentially a high-altitude chef, cooking a meal that can kill the waiter. He's hunched over a heavy, three-legged iron pot filled with burning coke, a high-carbon fuel that burns much hotter and cleaner than regular coal. It's a mainstream historical fact that these portable forges had to be hand-cranked. The heater turns a small rotary blower that forces air up through the fuel, fanning the embers into a white-hot roar. You watch as he dumps a handful of cold rivets onto the edge of the hearth. They look like oversized, unpainted lead soldiers, dull and gray. But as he nudges them into the center of the fire with his long-handled tongs, the transformation begins. I've always found it mesmerizing how steel changes state. It doesn't just get hot, it gains a soul. It starts as a bruised purple, then a cherry red, and finally, it hits that sweet spot of glowing incandescent orange. A quirky tidbit of the forge is that the heater would often keep a potato or an onion near the edge of the coals. The heat was so consistent and intense that he could slow roast his lunch while preparing the building's hardware. I find it deeply relatable that even when building the tallest structure on Earth, a man's primary concern is often just a well-cooked snack. The heater is constantly pedaling the air, his arm moving in a rhythmic circle that never seems to tire. He's looking for the soaking heat. If the rivet is only hot on the outside, the core stays hard, and the gunman won't be able to mushroom the head properly. Historians still argue whether the high rate of rivet failure in early skyscrapers was due to poor metallurgy or simply heaters trying to work too fast to keep up with the grueling pace of the floor-a-day schedules. You can see the intensity in his eyes. He's reading the fire like a scholar reads a rare manuscript. He knows that if a rivet starts throwing off white sparks, it's burning. The carbon is literally leaving the steel, and it's useless. I think there's a brutal beauty in this tiny, portable hell perched on a windy girder. You see the heater pick up a rivet and tap it against the side of the forge to knock off the loose slag. It clinks with a high metallic ring that tells him the steel is alive. I've always felt that the heater is the most isolated member of the gang. While the other three are huddled together at the joint, he's often 30 or 40 feet away, a lone sentinel of fire in a world of cold wind. He's the one who sets the tempo. If he's slow, the gang sits and smokes. If he's fast, they sweat and curse. You notice the way he shields his eyes with one hand. There were no high-tech tinted goggles here, just a squint and a prayer. Personally, I would probably lose my eyebrows within 20 minutes, but this man seems to have a skin like seasoned leather. He nudges the blower a bit faster, and the roar of the forge increases. It's a sound that reminds you of a jet engine, a focused, hungry growl. It's relatable. In a strange way, how we tame these elemental forces, fire and air, just to make a piece of metal soft enough to do our bidding. The heater suddenly stops cranking. The silence that follows is heavy. He's found the perfect rivet. He reaches in with the tongs, gripping the shank with practiced ease. This is the transition point. I've always found it funny how we obsess over precision engineering today. Yet the Empire State Building was built by a guy literally eyeballing the color of a piece of toast in a fire. Historians still argue whether the introduction of electric rivet heaters in the late 1930s actually improved construction, or if the old-school coal forges provided a more malleable heat that the workers preferred. You watch him shift his weight. He isn't looking at the forge anymore. He's looking at the catcher, who is standing on a plank 60 feet across a yawning chasm. I think the most terrifying part of this isn't the fire, but the communication. They don't shout. The wind is too loud for that. They don't wave. The heater simply lifts the glowing rivet and gives a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It's a silent contract. He's about to release a piece of metal heated to nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit into the open air. I find it fascinating that the heater's forge had to be moved every few hours as the gang progressed. He'd have to carry that heavy ash-filled pot across the beams, a task that seems like an invitation to a very short, very final trip to the pavement. But there's a casualness to his movements that settles your nerves. He treats the fire like an old, temperamental dog. He respects it, but he's definitely the boss. He taps the rivet one last time, clearing a speck of dust, and then pulls back his arm. The heat from the forge is so intense that you can feel it through your heavy wool coat. It's a reminder that beneath the glamour of the roaring 20s, there was a core of sheer industrial violence. Everything was forged in fire: the steel, the money, the city itself. Personally, I suspect the heater is the only one who stays warm on these winter mornings, though he probably pays for it with a permanent tan and lungs full of coke dust. He prepares to throw. You realize that this is the moment where logistics becomes art. He isn't just tossing a bolt. He's sending a pulse of energy to the heart of the building. I've always felt that the heater is the heartbeat of the skyscraper. If he stops, the building stops. He draws back the tongs, his eyes locked on the catcher's tin bucket. The orange glow of the rivet reflects in his pupils, a tiny spark of the sun brought down to earth. You hold your breath. The flaming baseball is about to leave the mound. The moment the heater's arm snakes back, the world seems to go quiet, despite the screaming wind and the distant clatter of a city in motion. You are about to witness the flaming baseball in its true, lethal glory. Personally, I've always found it terrifying that the entire structural integrity of a skyscraper depends on a game of catch that would make a major league outfielder break into a cold sweat. The heater doesn't just lob the rivet, he snaps his wrist, sending that glowing 2,000-degree cylinder of steel on a flat, whistling trajectory across the open sky. It's a mainstream historical fact that these rivets were thrown over distances of 30, 60, or even 70 feet, often passing through the literal skeleton of the building, where a single collision with a crossbeam would send it tumbling like a tiny meteor toward the unsuspecting streets below. I think there's a specific kind of physics at play here that isn't taught in textbooks. It's roughneck ballistics. You watch the rivet cut through the air, a streak of bright neon orange against the gray industrial haze of Manhattan. It's relatable, in a chaotic way, how much we trust in muscle memory. The heater doesn't use a sight or a gauge. He just knows the wind. He has to account for the way the air currents whip around the corners of the unfinished structure, which can change in a heartbeat. A quirky tidbit of the trade is that a truly legendary heater could throw a hook or a curve rivet to get it around an obstructing pillar. A feat of aerodynamics that feels like it should be physically impossible. I've always felt that if these guys had been born in a different era, they would have been world-class athletes. But in 1920, their stadium was a construction site, and their only fans were the pigeons. As the rivet flies, you realize that it's cooling down every second it spends in the air. If the toss is too high and slow, the rivet loses its soaking heat and becomes a dud. Historians still argue whether the transition from hand-tossing to pneumatic rivet passers, long flexible tubes that blew the rivet to the catcher, was resisted by the gangs because it was slower, or simply because it took the sport out of the job. Personally, I think it was the sport. There is a primal satisfaction in watching that orange spark bridge the gap between two men. You see the rivet spinning end over end, a miniature sun defying gravity for a fraction of a second. The wind catches the projectile, drifting it slightly to the left. I find it relatable that even when you're doing something as epic as building the Chrysler Building, a sudden gust of wind can make you look like a total amateur. But the heater doesn't panic. He's already reaching for the next gray slug of steel. He knows his partner. I've always found the bond between the heater and the catcher to be one of the most intense examples of human cooperation. It's a silent, high-stakes dialogue. The heater provides the fire, and the catcher provides the destination. I think the most stressful part for a spectator is the thought of a miss. If that rivet isn't caught, it doesn't just disappear. It becomes a lethal, white-hot bullet heading for the sidewalk. Historians still argue about how many pedestrians were actually injured by stray rivets, as the companies were notoriously tight-lipped about accidents to avoid lawsuits. You look down at the street, and it's a long, long way for a piece of iron to travel. It makes you realize that the boring USA beneath you is actually living in a reign of potential fire, protected only by the steady hands of men who probably haven't had a vacation in 3 years. You watch the rivet reach the apex of its arc. It seems to hang there for a moment, suspended against the backdrop of the Hudson River. It's a beautiful, terrifying image. I've always thought that if you took a photo of this, people would think it was a special effect. But the heat you feel on your face as it passes is very real. It's a dry, biting heat that smells like the very soul of the forge. The rivet begins its descent, accelerating toward the catcher, who is waiting with a battered tin can that looks like it once held tomatoes or soup. Personally, I suspect the catcher's tin is the most humble yet important piece of equipment in the world at this moment. It's not an engineered safety device. It's a piece of trash repurposed for greatness. You see the catcher shift his weight on his narrow wooden plank. He isn't reaching out with his hands. That would be a quick trip to the burn ward. He's using the bucket, like a glove. I find it relatable that despite the millions of dollars being poured into these buildings, the actual last mile of construction depends on a 5-cent tin can. The trajectory is perfect. The rivet isn't just heading toward the catcher. It's heading into the bucket. I think the most amazing thing is the lack of fanfare. There's no cheering, no good job, just the grim, focused reality of the work. It's a rhythm that has to be maintained. If the heater misses his mark, he doesn't apologize. He just adjusts. It's a world where results are the only currency that matters. You can hear the whistle of the wind through the hollow steel beams, a low, haunting moan that serves as the soundtrack to the rivet's flight. As the projectile nears the catcher, you notice the way his eyes never leave the orange spark. It's the same look a hunter gives his prey. I've always felt that these men possessed a level of presence that we've lost in our world of notifications and distractions. They are 100% in the moment. Because the moment is 2,000 degrees hot and moving at 30 miles per hour. You realize that the flaming baseball isn't just a gimmick. It's the most efficient way to move heat from the fire to the frame. The rivet is inches away now. You can see the glow reflecting off the catcher's grease-stained face. It's a moment of pure, industrial theater. Personally, I think this is the peak of the 1920s spirit. Fearless, fast, and just a little bit crazy. The city below has no idea that a small piece of the sun is currently flying through the air above their heads. You grip the girder, your knuckles white, waiting for the sound of the catch. It's the sound that means the building is one step closer to the stars. The sound of the catch is a sharp, hollow clank thud, the unmistakable ring of hot metal meeting an old tin bucket. It's a sound that signifies another successful bridge across the abyss. You watch the catcher, who is standing on a platform that looks like a couple of discarded barn doors lashed together with hemp rope. Personally, I think the catcher is the true unsung hero of the skyline. He is the goalie in a game where the ball is a molten slug and the stadium has no floor. He doesn't catch the rivet with his hands, of course, unless he wants to spend the rest of his life explaining why he only has 2 fingers. He uses that battered, soot-blackened bucket, which is often padded with a layer of damp sand or ashes at the bottom, to keep the rivet from bouncing back out like a lethal rubber ball. I've always found it relatable that the catcher's primary tool is basically a piece of trash. It's a mainstream historical fact that these buckets were often old industrial-sized cans that previously held rivets, paint, or even canned peaches. There is something profoundly human about the way we take the most sophisticated architectural projects in history and build them using a soup can. You watch him peer into the bucket, the orange glow illuminating his face from below, making him look like a character in a gothic horror novel. He doesn't waste a second. He uses a pair of short tongs to fish the rivet out of the bucket. If he's too slow, the rivet will weld itself to the bottom of his can, and he'll have to spend 5 minutes beating it loose with a hammer. Which I imagine is the 1920s equivalent of your computer freezing right when you're about to finish a long email. The catcher then performs a move that is pure muscle memory. He taps the rivet against a beam to knock off any remaining scale, and then, with a flick of his wrist, drops it into the pre-drilled hole in the steel joint. I think the most nerve-wracking part of this is the handoff. Historians still argue whether the high number of near misses reported on these sites were due to the catcher's fatigue or the heater's overenthusiasm. If the catcher drops the rivet while trying to get it into the hole, it's a long, long fall. A quirky tidbit of the high steel culture is that if a catcher dropped a rivet, the rest of the gang would often give him a silent treatment for the next hour, not out of cruelty, but because, in a world of life and death, mistakes are considered a breach of the sacred contract of competence. I find it fascinating that the catcher is often the youngest or the newest member of the gang, despite having the job that requires the most immediate reflexes. It's a trial by fire, literally. Personally, I'd be shaking so hard the bucket would sound like a maraca. But you see this man stand there with a bored, almost sleepy expression. He's seen 1,000 flaming baseballs today, and he expects to see 1,000 more. I've always felt that there's a certain zen of the bucket at play here. He isn't thinking about the 300-foot drop or the wind. He's just thinking about the arc of the orange light. As the catcher drops the rivet into the hole, he gives a sharp whistle or a quick nod to the bucker-up. This is the moment where the living heat meets the dead steel of the building. I find it relatable that even in this massive industrial machine, everything depends on a series of tiny personal handoffs. You can see the steam rising from the bucket if the sand is damp. A small, ghostly cloud that vanishes instantly into the Manhattan wind. It's a sensory overload. The smell of hot metal, the taste of salt air, the vibration of the beams under your boots. I think the most incredible part is the catcher's posture. He isn't braced against anything. He's just standing there, feet apart, absorbing the sway of the building. Historians still argue whether the lack of safety railings on these catching platforms was a deliberate choice to keep the workers' mobility high, or just a blatant disregard for human life by the contractors. To the catcher, it doesn't matter. He has a bucket, a pair of tongs, and a job to do. He looks back at the heater, signaling that the catcher's mitt is empty and ready for the next one. You notice the catcher wiping a smudge of grease off his forehead with the back of his glove. He looks out over the city for a split second, a quick glance at the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, and then refocuses. I've always thought that these men had the best and worst view in the world. They could see the entire horizon, but they couldn't afford to look at it for more than a second. It's a paradox of the job. You're at the top of the world, but your world is only as big as a tin bucket. Personally, I find it hilarious that we think of extreme sports today as something you do on the weekend with expensive gear. These guys were doing extreme sports for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, in wool trousers and flat caps. The catcher's tin is more than a tool. It's a symbol of the era's make-do attitude. It's the boring USA at its most brilliantly improvisational. You realize that the entire skyline is essentially a collection of rivets that successfully made it into a soup can. The next rivet is already in the air. You see the catcher track it, a slight adjustment of his torso, a small step to the left. He doesn't look worried. He looks like a man waiting for a bus. I've always felt that this level of professional nonchalance is the most authentic part of the ironworker's soul. They didn't see themselves as daredevils. They saw themselves as tradesmen. But as that orange spark nears the bucket, you can't help but feel a jolt of adrenaline. It's a beautiful, terrifying dance, and the catcher is the one holding the rhythm. He snaps the bucket out, catches the rivet with a dull thud, and the cycle begins again. I find it relatable that the most high-stakes jobs often become the most repetitive. It's the repetition that keeps you alive. If you stop to think about how crazy it is, you lose your edge. So, you don't think. You just catch. You just move. You just build. The building is hungry for more steel, and the catcher is the one feeding it, one flaming baseball at a time. As the catcher drops the glowing rivet into its destined hole, the focus shifts to the man waiting on the opposite side of the steel, the bucker-up. Personally, I've always thought that if the heater is the chef and the catcher is the goalie, then the bucker-up is the anchor. He is the physical wall that the rest of the gang leans on. He stands there holding a dolly bar, a massive, solid steel lever that weighs upward of 20 or 30 pounds. It's a mainstream historical fact that the bucker-up's primary responsibility is to brace the head of the rivet with his dolly bar so that when the pneumatic hammer strikes from the other side, the rivet doesn't simply shoot out like a flaming bullet. He has to use his entire body weight, leaning his shoulder or chest against the bar, to counter the violent force of the gun. I think the most relatable thing about the bucker-up is the sheer bone-deep exhaustion he must feel by noon. Imagine standing on a 6-inch beam, leaning into a vibrating piece of iron, while the wind tries to peel you off the building like a loose sticker. There is no ergonomic support here. A quirky tidbit of the high steel life is that many bucker-ups would wrap their dolly bars in old rags or pieces of tire rubber, not to protect the steel, but to provide a tiny bit of cushioning for their own ribs and shoulders. I've always felt that the bucker-up is the silent martyr of the skyscraper. He doesn't get the cinematic toss of the heater or the acrobatic catch of the catcher. He just gets a bruised collarbone and a headache that lasts until 1935. Historians still argue whether the Bucker-Up had the highest rate of long-term physical disability among the ironworkers due to the white finger disease caused by constant vibration or the internal bruising from the dolly bar. You watch him now, bracing himself. He looks like he's trying to push the entire building over. He's wedged his feet against a rivet head from a previous floor, locking his knees. I find it fascinating how the human body adapts to these brutal requirements, turning itself into a living kickstand for a pneumatic drill. He doesn't say a word. He just waits for the signal from the gunman. I've always found it funny how we talk about team building in modern offices with trust falls and retreats. In the 1920s, a trust fall was the Bucker-Up trusting that the catcher actually put the rivet in the hole before he leaned his weight onto the dolly bar. If the hole is empty, he's just leaning into the abyss. There is a deep, unspoken intimacy in this work. You can see the steam rising off his wool coat as his body heat meets the cold morning air. Personally, I suspect the Bucker-Up is the one who sleeps the soundest at night, mostly because his muscles are probably too tired to even twitch. The Bucker-Up's world is one of intense, localized pressure. He isn't looking at the Manhattan skyline or the birds or the tugboats. He is looking at a single glowing orange circle of steel about 3 inches in front of his nose. I think there's a strange, claustrophobic zen to that. Amidst the vast open sky, his entire universe is reduced to a 3/4-inch hole. Historians still argue whether the transition to offset dolly bars, which allowed the Bucker-Up to stand in slightly safer positions, was a response to worker demand or just a way for companies to squeeze more rivets out of a gang per hour. You notice the way he grips the bar. His hands are thick, the skin worn down to a texture that looks more like wood than flesh. I find it relatable that despite the epic scale of the project, the actual success of the joint comes down to one man's stubborn refusal to be pushed backward. He is the personification of the boring USA, the quiet, grueling effort that happens behind the scenes of every great monument. If he flinches, the rivet head won't be flush, and the whole joint might have to be cut out and redone, which would earn him the eternal wrath of the foreman. I've always felt that the Bucker-Up's job is the most tactile. He feels the building's heart beating through that bar. When the gunman starts, the vibration travels through the rivet, through the dolly bar, and directly into the Bucker-Up's skeleton. He becomes part of the steel frame for a few seconds. Personally, I would probably lose my teeth from the chattering, but he stands there like a statue. It's a level of physical discipline that feels almost alien to us today. We live in a world of soft touchscreens and haptic feedback. He lives in a world of raw, unbuffered kinetic energy. The gunman taps the beam twice, the signal that the hammer is about to drop. The Bucker-Up takes a deep breath, squares his jaw, and pushes. I find it fascinating that the communication is so minimalist. They don't need a meeting, they just need a tap. I think there's a specific kind of dignity in that silence. They know the stakes, they know the rhythm, they know each other. You see the Bucker-Up's muscles bulge under his shirt, a testament to a diet of black coffee, steak, and sheer willpower. I think the most relatable part of his character is the way he occasionally glances at the sky during the brief pauses between rivets. It's a quick moment to remind himself that he's still a human being and not just a component of the skyscraper. But the moment the next flaming baseball lands in the bucket, he's back in position. He is the immovable object meeting the irresistible force of the pneumatic gun. As you watch him, you realize that the skyscraper isn't just a triumph of engineering, it's a triumph of endurance. Every floor is a layer of these four-man stories, repeated thousands of times. The bucker-up is the one holding it all together, literally bracing the past against the future. Personally, I think he deserves a statue in the lobby of every building he ever worked on, but he'd probably just want a cold beer and a place to sit down. The gunman raises the hammer, the bucker-up leans in, and the sky is about to explode with noise. The pneumatic hammer, or the gun, is a 30-pound beast of iron and air, and the gunman handles it like a violinist handles a bow. If the violin was a jackhammer and the music was a deafening industrial scream. Personally, I've always found it amazing that anyone can maintain fine motor skills while their entire arm is being vibrated at several thousand cycles per minute. The gunman is the closer. His job is to take that glowing orange rivet and, in a matter of seconds, batter the protruding end into a smooth, rounded mushroom head that locks the steel beams together forever. It's a mainstream historical fact that these pneumatic hammers were powered by massive air compressors located on the ground or a lower staging floor, with long, snaking rubber hoses draped over the girders like high-altitude pythons. I think the most relatable thing about the gunman is the sheer bravado he needs to possess. He's often leaning out over the edge of the beam to get the right angle, his feet braced against nothing but thin air and hope. A quirky tidbit of the era is that the gunman would often use his gun to signal the rest of the crew. A short burst of rat-tat-tat meant he was ready, while a long, sustained roar meant there was a problem with the air pressure. I've always felt that the gunman is the rock star of the rivet gang. He's the one making all the noise, and he's the one who literally puts the finishing touch on every joint. Historians still argue whether the deafening noise of the pneumatic hammers contributed more to the workers' legendary iron workers' stare than the height itself. You watch the gunman bring the cup-shaped head of the hammer down onto the glowing rivet. The moment he pulls the trigger, the boring USA disappears, replaced by a violent, rhythmic cacophony. The vibration is so intense that you can see the dust dancing on the girders 50 feet away. I find it fascinating how the gunman has to stay perfectly still while his tool is trying to shake him off the building. He has to apply exactly the right amount of pressure. Too much and he might slip. Too little and the rivet head won't form correctly before the steel cools and hardens. Personally, I suspect the gunman's internal organs are probably rearranged by the time he hits his 30s, but there's an undeniable grace in the way he rides the bucking machine. I've always found it funny how we talk about precision in our digital age. But the gunman's precision is purely tactile. He can feel through the handles of the gun when the rivet has seated. There's a change in the pitch of the vibration, a hardening of the resistance. It's a mainstream historical fact that a good rivet gang could drive 4 rivets a minute, which is one every 15 seconds. That includes the toss, the catch, the insert, and the hammer. It's a speed that seems impossible when you consider the stakes. Historians still argue whether this frantic pace was a byproduct of the piece rate pay system, where gangs were paid by the rivet, or simply a matter of pride among the men to be the fastest on the site. I find it relatable that the gunman usually wears the most protective gear, heavy leather aprons and thick gauntlets, because the slag, or the hot sparks of steel, flies everywhere during the hammering process. It's like standing in a shower of tiny, red-hot needles. You see the sparks cascading over the side of the building, a golden waterfall that vanishes before it hits the street. I've always thought that if you saw this from below at night, it would look like the building was crying fire. But up here, it's just another Tuesday. The gunman doesn't flinch. He's locked in, his eyes narrowed, his jaw set against the rattling of his own teeth. The bucker-up on the other side is feeling every single one of those blows. I think the most incredible part of this partnership is the synchronization. The gunman knows exactly when the bucker-up has leaned in, and the bucker-up knows exactly how long the gunman will burst. It's a dance of raw power. Personally, I would probably be curled in a fetal position after the first 3 rivets, but these guys treat it like a casual game of darts. A quirky tidbit is that many ironworkers actually lost the ability to hear certain frequencies because of the specific pitch of the pneumatic gun, meaning they could hear a train coming from miles away but couldn't hear their wives talking across the dinner table, which, I suppose, some of them might have considered a professional perk. You notice the gunman's boots. They're often worn down on one side from the way he braces his weight against the flange of the I-beam. Everything about his body has been molded by the work. I've always felt that the 1920s skyscraper wasn't just built by men, it was built out of them. Their hearing, their joints, and their nerves were the hidden materials of the Chrysler Building. Historians still argue whether the transition to bolting and welding in later decades was purely for safety, or because the sheer physical toll of riveting was becoming unsustainable for the workforce. As the gunman finishes the rivet, he pulls the hammer back, and the sudden silence is almost as jarring as the noise. The rivet head is now a perfect, smooth dome, cooling from orange to a dull, bruised purple. It's beautiful. I find it relatable that there's a sense of doneness here that we rarely get in modern office work. You can look at that rivet and know it will be there for 100 years. You don't need to sync it or upload it. It's just a permanent part of the world now. The gunman wipes a streak of oil from the barrel of his gun and nods to the heater. I think the most fascinating part of the gunman's role is the after image. Even after he stops, his hands continue to shake for a few minutes. It's a phantom vibration, a ghost in the nerves. He lights a cigarette with a steady hand, or as steady as it can be, and takes a long drag, looking out over the East River. He isn't thinking about the engineering marvel he's creating, he's thinking about the next hole that needs filling. Personally, I find that lack of pretension to be the most authentic thing about the era. They weren't building icons, they were just driving rivets. The heater is already prep cranking the forge for the next round. The rhythm is relentless. I've always felt that the pneumatic hammer is the heartbeat of the city's ambition. It's loud, it's violent, and it's completely unstoppable. You stand there on your girder, the vibration still humming in your own boots, and you realize that the gunman is the one who finally locks the dream into reality. He pulls the trigger again, and the sky once more fills with the sound of progress. The beautiful, boring, bone-shaking sound of a city reaching for the sun. Now that the hammer has fallen silent for a fleeting moment, you have to move. This is the part of the job that separates the ironworkers from the tourists, walking the sky. You aren't on a finished floor with walls and a ceiling, you're on a skeleton. To get to the next joint, you have to navigate the narrow path, which is essentially the top flange of an I-beam that's maybe 8 to 12 inches wide. Personally, I get a little dizzy just standing on a sturdy stepladder to change a light bulb, so the idea of strolling across a metal tightrope with a 300-foot drop on either side feels like a personal affront to my survival instincts. But for you, in 1925, this is just your hallway. There are no safety nets. There are no guardrails. It's a mainstream historical fact that during the construction of early 20th century skyscrapers, it was colloquially estimated that one worker died for every $1 million spent, or roughly 1 death per floor. Though modern historians have debunked this as a bit of morbid exaggeration used to bolster the tough guy image of the trade. I think the most relatable thing about walking the beams is the ironworker's gait. You don't walk like a normal person, You develop a flat-footed, heavy-set shuffle that keeps your center of gravity low and wide. You never cross your feet. You slide one forward, then the other, feeling the texture of the steel through your soles. I've always found it funny how we pay for expensive sensory experiences today. Yet these guys were getting a sensory overload for free every time they needed to use the restroom. A quirky tidbit of the high steel walk is that workers would often carry their tools in a way that helped them balance. A heavy wrench in one hand acting like a makeshift tightrope walker's pole. It's a primitive, instinctive kind of physics that I find much more authentic than anything you'd find in a lab. Historians still argue whether the legendary fearlessness of the ironworkers was a genuine psychological trait or a carefully constructed social mask. When you're walking that beam, if you show fear, you lose the respect of the gang. And if you lose their respect, you lose your spot. Personally, I suspect it's a bit of both. You learn to look through the height. You don't look at the street, you look at the next bolt hole. You focus on the task, and the abyss becomes just a background color. I find it relatable that even in the most extreme conditions, the human brain can normalize almost anything. You're not defying death. You're just going to work. You feel the wind again, that persistent, invisible hand. I've always felt that the wind is the true enemy of the skywalker. It doesn't just push, it swirls and eddies. It can create a sudden vacuum that pulls you toward the edge. I find it fascinating that ironworkers developed a sixth sense for air pressure. They could feel a change in the wind before it hit them, tensing their core muscles to compensate. It's a level of body awareness that makes a yoga instructor look like a bumbling amateur. You stop for a second, letting a particularly strong gust pass, and you look at your hands. They're steady. That's the most important thing. If your hands start to shake, you're done. I think the most terrifying part of walking the sky is the false sense of security. You've done this 1,000 times. You know every inch of the steel. But all it takes is a single patch of oil, a loose piece of gravel, or a bit of morning frost to turn a routine walk into a tragedy. Personally, I find the 1920s lack of safety gear to be a baffling mixture of can-do spirit and absolute negligence. Historians still argue whether the workers actually wanted safety lines, as some records suggest they felt the ropes were a tripping hazard that caused more accidents than they prevented. It's a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease. Or at least, that's what the foreman told the insurance companies. You see a coworker walking toward you from the opposite direction. There's no room to pass. One of you has to step out onto a gusset plate, a triangular piece of steel connecting the beams, to let the other go by. I've always found it amazing how polite these interactions are. You give a little nod, a morning bill, as if you're passing each other in a grocery store aisle. I find it relatable that even when you're hanging over a void, social etiquette still applies. You don't shove, you don't rush. You move with a deliberate, slow-motion grace that is both beautiful and deeply unsettling to watch from the ground. As you walk, you notice the sounds of the city are different up here. The honking horns and shouting vendors are a muffled, distant hum, like the sound of a sea in a shell. But the sounds of the building are sharp and immediate. The creak of the steel as it expands in the sun. The whistle of the wind through the rivet holes. I've always thought that the skyscraper has its own language, and you're one of the few people who actually speaks it. You reach the end of the beam and step onto a temporary wooden platform. Your heart rate doesn't even spike. Why would it? You're exactly where you're supposed to be. I think the most authentic part of this experience is the view from the top. You can see the curve of the Earth if you look far enough toward the Atlantic. You see the city as a grand, unfinished project, a sprawling mess of brick and ambition that you are literally pulling toward the heavens. Personally, I find a strange comfort in that. We often feel so small and insignificant in the modern world. But up here, you are the giant. You are the one shaping the horizon. It's a powerful, intoxicating feeling, and I suspect it's why these men kept coming back, floor after floor, year after year. The heater gives a sharp whistle. The next rivet is ready. You have to get back to your station. I find it relatable that the magic of the view is always cut short by the reality of the clock. There's no time for philosophy when there's steel to be joined. You turn around and begin the return shuffle, the wind at your back this time. You're not thinking about the drop anymore. You're thinking about the catch. You're thinking about the rhythm. As you navigate the last few feet of the girder, you realize that walking the sky has changed you. You can't walk on a normal sidewalk anymore without feeling like it's too wide, too easy, too boring. I've always felt that the ironworkers were a breed apart. Men who had traded the safety of the earth for the clarity of the clouds. You step back onto the catching platform, grip your tin bucket, and prepare for the next flaming baseball. The boring USA is down there somewhere, but up here, every step is a victory over gravity. Behind the acrobatics of the rivet and the terrifying walks across the sky, there is a distinct, ironclad culture that defines the men you work beside. You aren't just a random collection of laborers, you are part of a brotherhood known as roughnecks. Personally, I've always found it fascinating how certain high-risk professions create their own insular societies, with rules that the ground dwellers will never fully grasp. In the 1920s, this brotherhood was a unique blend of heritage and grit. A mainstream historical fact that often surprises people is the prominent role of the Mohawk ironworkers from the Kahnawake and Akwesasne reserves. Legend had it, and many newspapers of the day printed it as gospel, that Native Americans had an innate biological lack of fear regarding heights. However, historians still argue whether this was true or if it was simply a cultural adaptation born from the fact that Mohawk men had been working as expert river guides and bridge builders for generations, mastering the art of balance long before the first skyscraper touched the New York clouds. I think the most relatable thing about this roughneck culture is the way it uses humor to mask the constant presence of death. You're sitting on a beam during a brief lull, and someone cracks a joke about how it's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop at the bottom. It's a dark, cynical kind of wit that I find incredibly authentic. If you took everything seriously up here, your nerves would snap like a cheap hemp rope. I've always felt that the 1920s ironworker was a master of the poker face. You don't brag about your bravery, and you certainly don't talk about your fear. A quirky tidbit of the trade is that many of these men were incredibly superstitious. For instance, some would refuse to work if they saw a black bird land on a specific girder, while others believed that carrying a specific lucky coin in their pocket was the only thing keeping the wind from blowing them off. It's funny how, in an age of steel and science, we still lean on the same charms our ancestors used in caves. You watch the interactions between the Mohawk workers and the Irish and Scandinavian immigrants. Up here, the social hierarchies of the street don't exist. The only thing that matters is, can you do the job? Personally, I think this is the most honest version of the American dream, a meritocracy of the abyss. If a man can catch a rivet or buck a hammer, he's your brother. I find it relatable that even in a decade defined by intense us versus them mentalities, the high steel was a neutral zone. Historians still argue whether the dangerous nature of the work forced a level of racial and ethnic integration that was decades ahead of the rest of the country. or if it was simply a pragmatic survival tactic. There's also the matter of the boomy, the iron worker who traveled from city to city, following the steel. I've always felt a bit of envy for that nomadic spirit. You'd finish a bridge in Chicago, hop a freight train to New York for a skyscraper, and then head to San Francisco for the next big project. I find it relatable that these men were the digital nomads of the industrial age, trading a permanent home for the thrill of the next big view. They carried their lives in a small canvas bag and their skills in their hands. It's a boring USA myth that everyone in the 20s wanted a white picket fence. Some people just wanted to be as far away from a fence as humanly possible. I think the most telling part of the roughneck culture is the silent code. If someone dies, and it happens, the work often stops for the day. But by the next morning, the hammer is back at it. There are no long eulogies. Personally, I find that brutal. But perhaps it's the only way they could cope. To acknowledge the tragedy too deeply would be to admit that the same thing could happen to you. You see a man wearing a flat cap that belonged to his father, also an iron worker. This isn't just a job, it's a lineage. I find it fascinating how the secrets of the trade, how to read a forge, how to walk against a crosswind, were passed down like sacred oral traditions. Historians still argue whether the intense hypermasculinity of the iron workers was a burden that led to high rates of alcoholism in the speakeasies below. You see it in the way the men drink their coffee, black, bitter, and scalding hot. I've always thought that if you offered one of these guys a lavender oat milk latte, he'd probably throw you off the 40th floor. I find it relatable that when your daily life is this intense, you crave simplicity. You want a strong drink, a heavy meal, and a quiet place to sit. The roughneck culture was a reaction to the noise. They became as hard as the steel they were riveting. You notice the tattoos on some of the older men. Anchors, eagles, and the names of women in faraway ports. It's a reminder that many of these workers were former sailors who traded the mast for the I-beam. I find it fascinating that the terminology of the skyscraper is often borrowed from the sea. You deck a floor, you use rigging, and you watch the horizon. Personally, I've always felt that the skyscraper is just a ship that's been buried upright in the dirt. You're the crew, and the wind is your constant navigator. As the sun climbs higher, the camaraderie becomes more apparent. A man reaches out to steady a younger worker whose foot slipped an inch. No words are exchanged, just a firm grip on a shoulder. I find it relatable that the deepest bonds aren't built on conversation, but on shared experience. You realize that you aren't just building a building, you're building a reputation. If you're a good man on the steel, that's the highest honor you can achieve. The boring USA might judge you by your bank account, but up here, you're judged by your grip. I think the most authentic part of this culture is the lack of ego. Despite the tough guy image, there's no room for arrogance. Arrogance gets you killed. The best iron workers are the ones who respect the steel and respect the height. Personally, I suspect that the true roughneck is the most humble man in New York, because he knows exactly how small he is compared to gravity. You look at your gang, the heater, the bucker-up, the gunman, and you feel a surge of quiet pride. You belong to the sky. The whistle for the next phase of work blows, a sharp, metallic scream. The culture of silence returns as everyone moves back to their stations. I've always felt that the 1920s ironworker was a silent poet whose medium was fire and iron. You aren't just a laborer, you're a sky dweller, a member of the most exclusive club in the world. You find your spot on the beam, feeling the familiar vibration of the compressor below. The roughnecks are ready. The boring USA is watching from the sidewalk, but they'll never know what it feels like to truly be part of the gang. The sun has finally reached its zenith, and the shadow of the crane no longer stretches across the girders. It pools directly beneath your feet. This is the moment the entire city below recognizes: the lunch hour. But while the clerks and stenographers in the offices below are tucking into deli sandwiches at wooden desks, you are about to participate in the most iconic, vertigo-inducing ritual of the 1920s. Personally, I've always found it a bit theatrical that ironworkers didn't bother climbing down to the ground for a 30-minute break. I mean, climbing down 50 flights of stairs just to climb back up is a workout no one is getting paid for. So, you do what any sensible, slightly insane roughneck does. You find a comfortable spot on a raw steel beam, dangle your legs over the 300-foot drop, and open your tin lunch pail. It's a mainstream historical fact that the famous 1932 photograph Lunch Atop a Skyscraper, showing 11 men sitting on a girder during the construction of the RCA building, was actually a staged publicity stunt for the Rockefeller Center. However, historians still argue whether the staging makes it any less authentic. While the men were positioned for the camera, they really were that high up. They really weren't wearing harnesses, and they really did eat their lunch on those beams every single day. I find it deeply relatable that even in the face of certain death, the human desire for a sandwich and a moment of peace wins out. You pull out a thick slab of rye bread with ham and maybe a hard-boiled egg that's been rattling around in your pail since 6 a.m. It's simple, it's dry, and it tastes like the best meal you've ever had because you're still alive to eat it. I think the most fascinating part of lunch on the high steel is the conversation, or the lack thereof. You're sitting next to the gunman, and the buck are up, and the wind is whistling through your shoelaces. Personally, I'd be gripping the beam with both hands and hyperventilating. But you guys are swapping stories about the Brooklyn Dodgers, or complaining about the price of nickel cigars. A quirky tidbit of the lunch hour is that ironworkers often shared their food in a communal fashion. If your wife packed extra pickles, you traded them for a slice of apple pie. I've always felt that these high-altitude picnics were the ultimate display of nonchalance. To eat while dangling over the abyss is the ultimate flex on gravity. It's the boring USA saying, "Yeah, I'm 300 feet up, but I still need my calories." Historians still argue whether these midday breaks were the most dangerous part of the day, because the workers' focus would drift. When you're riveting, you're locked in. When you're eating, you're just a guy on a bench, except the bench is 8 inches wide and moving slightly in the breeze. I find it relatable that your biggest concern isn't falling, but dropping your thermos. If a heavy glass-lined thermos falls from this height, it's a lethal missile by the time it reaches Fifth Avenue. You hold on to your coffee cup with a grip that is subconsciously tight, even as you laugh at a joke. I've always thought there's a specific kind of gallows humor that flourishes in these moments, a way of acknowledging the danger without letting it ruin your appetite. You look down between your boots. The yellow taxicabs look like tiny, frantic beetles scurrying through canyons of gray stone. It's a perspective very few humans had ever seen before this decade. I think the most authentic part of the lunch break is the sense of ownership. You aren't just a visitor up here, you're the landlord of the sky. Personally, I suspect that the high-altitude high is a real thing, a mixture of thin air and adrenaline that makes the ham sandwich taste like caviar. You see a coworker lie flat on his back on a girder for a 5-minute nap, his hat pulled over his eyes. I find that level of comfort absolutely baffling and deeply impressive. To sleep on the edge of forever requires a soul that is either very peaceful or very tired. I've always found it funny how we have wellness rooms and break pods in modern offices, yet these men found total relaxation on a piece of vibrating carbon steel. There's no HR department here to tell you that sitting on a girder is a safety violation. There's just the sun, the wind, and the smell of the city's coal fires drifting upward. A quirky tidbit is that some workers would actually bring small pets up with them, stray cats that lived in the staging areas, or even birds in cages, just for the company during these quiet moments. I find it relatable that we try to bring a piece of home into even the most hostile environments. The view from your lunchroom is unparalleled. You can see the smoke from the chimneys in New Jersey and the white caps on the Atlantic. I think the 1920s skyscraper was the first time humans truly felt like they had conquered nature, not by taming the wilderness, but by rising above it. But then, you feel a drop of rain, or perhaps just a mist from a passing cloud. It's a reminder that nature is still there, and it's much bigger than your building. Historians still argue whether the skyscraper boom was driven more by a need for office space or a primal competitive urge to have the highest lunchroom in the world. Personally, I think it was the latter. There's a certain ego in eating your lunch higher than the King of England lives. You pack your wax paper back into the tin pail. The 30 minutes are up. I find it relatable that the end of lunch always feels a bit too soon, especially when the next task involves catching flaming pieces of metal. You stand up, and for a split second, you feel that familiar sway. You stretch your arms out, feeling the blood return to your legs. The city below is still buzzing, oblivious to the 11 men who just had a picnic in the clouds. I've always felt that these lunch breaks were the heart of the Boring USA project. The quiet, human moments that happen in the middle of a monumental achievement. As you prepare to get back to work, you notice a discarded crust of bread falling off the beam. You watch it tumble, spinning smaller and smaller until it disappears into the haze. It's a sobering sight. It reminds you that gravity never takes a lunch break. It's always there, waiting for a mistake. Personally, I'd take that as a sign to go home, but you just turn back to the forge. The heater is already stoking the coals. The flaming baseballs are coming back into rotation. You give your lunch pail a little pat and tuck it into a safe corner of the staging area. The camaraderie of the break dissolves back into the disciplined silence of the gang. I think the most authentic thing about the 1920s ironworker wasn't the way he worked, but the way he rested, with a quiet, defiant grace that told the world he belonged exactly where he was. You find your spot on the beam, the wind picks up, and the afternoon shift begins. The sandwich is gone, the coffee is cold, and there are 500 more rivets to drive before the sun goes down. As the lunch hour fades, the city's background noise is suddenly pierced by a familiar, aggressive rhythm. You aren't just listening to construction, you are enduring the sound of progress. Personally, I've always found it funny how we complain about a neighbor's leaf blower or a distant car alarm today, when the New York of 1925 was essentially one giant, unshielded heavy metal concert. It's a mainstream historical fact that the staccato firing of pneumatic rivet guns could be heard from over 10 blocks away, reflecting off the brick and limestone canyons of Manhattan like machine gun fire. For you, standing on the 40th floor, the noise isn't just a sound. It's a physical force that vibrates in your chest and rattles the fillings in your teeth. I think the most relatable part of this auditory assault is how quickly you stop hearing it and start feeling it. You develop a selective deafness. A quirky tidbit of the era is that doctors began to notice ironworkers developing a very specific type of hearing loss called Boilermaker's ear, where the person could perfectly hear the low rumble of a distant train but was completely oblivious to the high-pitched voice of someone standing right next to them. I find it authentic in a rugged, almost tragic way. These men literally gave their silence to build the city's noise. Historians still argue whether the constant, deafening rhythm of the guns actually helped the rivet gangs maintain their speed, acting as a sort of industrial metronome that kept everyone in sync. Personally, I've always felt that the sound of the 1920s skyscraper was the true anthem of the boring USA. It wasn't jazz or the roar of a Gatsby party. It was the relentless thump, thump, thump of steel being pinned to the sky. You watch the gunman pull the trigger, and the air around the hammer seems to blur with the intensity of the vibration. I find it fascinating that the sound changed depending on the quality of the joint. If the rivet was tight and the bucker-up was doing his job, the sound was a sharp, high-pitched ping. If there was a gap, it was a dull, hollow thud. You learn to listen for the ping. It's the sound of safety. The noise is compounded by the sirens of tugboats in the harbor and the screech of the elevated trains below. I think the most incredible part is the communication system that evolved to survive this din. You don't talk, you use a series of sharp whistles and hand signals that look like a cryptic, high-stakes version of sign language. A tap on the beam with a wrench means ready. A finger pointed toward the forge means next. I've always thought that if you brought a modern office worker up here, they'd have a nervous breakdown within 5 minutes just from the sensory overload. It's relatable, though, how humans adapt, turning chaos into a language of efficiency. I find it fascinating that historians still argue about the psychological impact of this noise on the city's residents. Some newspapers of the 1920s campaigned against the rivet nuisance, calling for a ban on construction after 5 p.m. because people couldn't hear themselves think in their own living rooms. But to you, the noise is the sound of a paycheck. It's the sound of the world's tallest buildings claiming their territory. Personally, I suspect the reason the 1920s felt so roaring was simply because you had to yell just to be heard over the construction sites on every street corner. You notice the way the vibration travels through your boots and up your spine. It's a rhythmic pulse that seems to match your heartbeat. I've always felt that the roughneck isn't just a man working on a machine. He is the machine. You become a component in a pneumatic circuit. When the air compressor cycles on, your body tenses in anticipation. When it pops off, you relax. I find it relatable that in our modern world, we use white noise machines to sleep. But for the iron worker of 1927, the only way to find peace was to get so used to the noise that silence became the thing that felt wrong. There is a strange, industrial beauty to the sound when multiple gangs are working on different corners of the floor. It creates a polyrhythmic texture, a chaotic, overlapping percussion that defines the skyline. I think the most authentic part of the experience is the way the sound defines the boundaries of your world. Down on the street, people are looking up, shielding their ears. Up here, you are inside the bell. You are the one swinging the clapper. Personally, I'd probably be wearing earplugs made of wax. But you guys just take it raw, absorbing the energy of the city's growth. Historians still argue whether the transition to welding, which is silent, was pushed by city councils specifically to end the riveting wars. But that's years away. For now, the hammer is king. You see the gunman finish a joint and let the trigger go. The sudden drop in decibels makes your ears ring with a ghostly, high-pitched whine. It's the sound of the abyss calling back. I find it relatable that the silence feels heavier than the noise. You take a quick breath, the heater tosses a new flaming baseball, and the hammer begins its scream once more. The building is a giant tuning fork, vibrating with the ambition of a decade that didn't know how to slow down. I've always thought that the skyscrapers of New York are essentially frozen music, the physical record of 10 million rivets being hammered into place. You grip the bucket, feeling the metal tremble in your hand. The noise isn't just an annoyance, it's proof that you're building something that will last longer than the sound itself. The boring USA is loud, proud, and completely deaf to its own exhaustion. As the afternoon wears on, the shadows of the neighboring buildings begin to climb the steel frame. The noise doesn't stop. It just becomes part of the atmosphere, like the wind or the gravity. You realize that you'll be hearing that rat-tat-tat in your dreams tonight. Personally, I find a weird comfort in that. It means the work is moving. It means the skyline is rising. You nod to the gunman, the compressor roars back to life, and you settle back into the deafening, beautiful rhythm of progress. The pace of the work suddenly shifts from a steady rhythm to a frantic, all-out sprint. You aren't just building a skyscraper anymore. You are a participant in the great skyscraper race of 1930. Personally, I've always found it a bit hilarious that the two most powerful men in New York, Walter Chrysler and John J. Raskob of General Motors, were basically acting like two kids in a sandbox, seeing who could build the tallest tower. But for you, this corporate ego trip translates into a floor-a-day schedule that pushes the human body to its absolute limit. It's a mainstream historical fact that during the construction of the Empire State Building, the steel frame rose at a rate of 4.5 stories per week. You are living through the fastest construction project in human history, and the pressure is coming down from the clouds. I think the most relatable thing about this race is the feeling of being a small cog in a very large, very fast machine. You look over your shoulder and see the Chrysler Building's chrome spire glinting in the sun, mocking you. Your foreman is constantly checking his stopwatch, and the rivet gang is moving with a mechanical fluidity that feels almost supernatural. Historians still argue whether the extreme speed of the Empire State Project was a miracle of logistical planning or a dangerous gamble with the lives of the 5 contractors. I find it authentic in a desperate way. The Great Depression has just begun to bite, and every man on this steel knows there are 1,000 guys on the sidewalk who would take his place in a heartbeat for half the pay. A quirky tidbit of this vertical race is that the Empire State Building was actually nicknamed the Empty State Building for years because they built it so fast they didn't have enough tenants to fill the offices. I've always felt that the 1930s construction boom was the ultimate fake-it-till-you-make-it moment for America. You're up here riveting like your life depends on it, building a monument to a prosperity that, at the moment, has completely vanished from the ground. It's a paradox I find deeply relatable. We often work the hardest when the world feels the most uncertain. The logistics of the race are mind-boggling. You aren't just catching rivets. You're managing a supply chain that involves thousands of tons of steel being hauled up by derricks that are constantly being moved to higher floors. I find it fascinating that the derricks themselves had to be jumped every 2 floors, a process that required the rivet gangs to stop for a few hours while the heavy cranes were dismantled and reassembled on the newer, higher girders. Personally, I suspect those jump hours were the only thing keeping you from a total nervous breakdown. You'd sit on a keg of rivets, lighting a cigarette, watching the steam hoist haul up another bundle of I-beams that were still hot from the rolling mill in Pennsylvania. I think the most incredible part of the race was the competition between the different gangs. There was a mainstream rivalry, where the gangs working on the north side of the building would try to out-rivet the guys on the south. Historians still argue whether the Rivet King titles handed out by the newspapers were real accolades or just clever propaganda to keep the men working harder for the same wage. Regardless, I find it relatable that even in a job this dangerous, the human ego demands to be the fastest. You watch the heater pump his bellows with a feverish intensity, trying to keep up with a gunman who is driving rivets so fast the pneumatic hose is vibrating like a live wire. The wind at these heights, now reaching 60, 70, 80 stories, is a different beast entirely. It doesn't just push, it screams. It carries the smell of the Atlantic and the cold of the upper atmosphere. I've always thought that the 1930s race was a battle against the weather as much as against the Chrysler Building. If a storm rolled in, you didn't always go down. You'd huddle in the lee of a massive column, the rain turning the steel into a slippery, lethal slide. Personally, I'd be the first one down the stairs, but you stay. You stay because the boring USA is watching, and the clock is ticking. I find it fascinating that the Empire State Building was completed in just 1 year and 45 days. That's a pace that modern construction firms, with all their computers and safety harnesses, can't even dream of matching. It makes me feel a bit nostalgic for an era where good enough wasn't a concept, only higher and faster. A quirky tidbit is that the workers on the Empire State were so efficient that they actually finished the building ahead of schedule and under budget, which is a sentence that almost never appears in modern news. You look at the skyline of 1930, and it's a forest of cranes. Every block seems to be sprouting a new tower. I think the most authentic part of the race was the noise. Not just the rivets, but the steam whistles, the shouting of the derrick operators, and the constant clank of steel on steel. It was a symphony of ambition. Personally, I find the 1930s skyline more beautiful than the modern one because every inch of it was fought for with hand-thrown fire and bone-rattling hammers. As the sun begins its long slide toward the Jersey Palisades, you realize that you've driven nearly 500 rivets since lunch. Your hands are numb, your back is a map of knots, and your ears are ringing. But you look down at the floor below you, the one you just finished, and then up at the empty sky, where the next floor will be tomorrow. I've always felt that the roughneck was a time traveler, constantly pulling the future down to the present. You aren't just building a house for an insurance company, you're building the very definition of New York City. The race is relentless, but there's a glory in it. You are the elite. You are the men who are winning the race against gravity and against time. Personally, I find a lot of comfort in the thought that these buildings, built with such frantic energy, still stand as the rock-solid foundation of the city. The boring USA might be in a depression, but up here, business is booming. You take one last look at the Chrysler Spire. It looks a little smaller today. You nod to the gang, pack your tools, and prepare for the long walk down, knowing you'll be back to do it all over again at dawn. The sun dips lower, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the steel ribs of the city, and the romanticism of the skywalker life begins to give way to a cold, hard sobriety. This is where we talk about gravity's constant threat. Personally, I've always found it a bit chilling how casual the relationship with death was on these sites. It wasn't that the men were suicidal. It was that they had developed a professional numbness to the abyss. It's a mainstream historical fact that in the 1920s and 30s, insurance companies viewed ironwork as so hazardous that they often refused to issue policies to the men, or charged premiums that were essentially half a week's wages. You aren't just working against a deadline, you are working against a statistical certainty that eventually something, a gust of wind, a slippery beam, or a momentary distraction, will go wrong. I think the most relatable part of the danger is the near miss. You're walking a girder when a sudden downdraft catches your flat cap, and for a split second, your weight shifts. Your heart does that frantic double thump against your ribs, and your fingers instinctively curl as if they could grab the very air itself. A quirky tidbit of the high steel is that many workers developed a habit of talking to the building, whispering to the beams or the rivets to hold fast or stay true. I find it authentic in a primal way. When the world offers you no safety net, you start looking for spirits in the iron. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates were largely due to falls, or if falling objects, wrenches, rivets, and planks were the silent killers that claimed more lives on the lower floors. Personally, I suspect the death per floor myth was a way for the survivors to cope, turning their lost brothers into a toll paid to the sky. You look at the catcher's platform, which is just a few loosely tied planks. One frayed knot, and the whole stage becomes a trapdoor. I find it fascinating that even with the knowledge of these risks, there were no strikes for safety harnesses. In the 1920s, safety was often seen as an insult to a man's skill. If you needed a rope, you weren't an iron worker, you were a hobbyist. I've always felt that this toxic bravery was the most boring USA thing about the era. The idea that your life was a fair trade for a landmark. The threat isn't just vertical, it's internal. The bends from the rapid change in pressure when coming down from the heights, or the permanent lung damage from breathing in the forge's toxic coke fumes, were slow-motion dangers. I find it relatable that we often focus on the spectacular, dramatic accidents, while ignoring the quiet, grinding toll the job takes on the body. You see a veteran ironworker whose hands are so gnarled by the cold and the vibration that he can't even hold a fork properly at dinner. Yet he can still catch a flaming rivet without looking. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma of seeing coworkers fall led to the high turnover rate, or if the men simply became addicted to the adrenaline of the edge. I've always thought the most terrifying sound on a job site isn't the hammer. It's the sudden, absolute silence when a man shouts, "Below!" That single word clears the floors beneath you as everyone scrambles for cover, waiting for the impact of whatever has been surrendered to gravity. I find it relatable that in those moments, you don't look down. You look at your own feet. You check your own balance. It's a survival instinct that feels cold to an outsider, but is necessary to keep your own sanity. The boring USA is built on these moments of swallowed fear. You notice the gunman checking his air hose for leaks. A burst hose at this height can whip around like a frantic iron snake, capable of knocking a man off a beam in a heartbeat. I think the most authentic part of the threat is the way it forces you to become obsessed with detail. You check the derrick cables, you check the knots on the catching bucket. You check the soles of your boots for grease. Personally, I find a weird comfort in that obsession. It's the only part of the chaos you can control. You realize that the building doesn't care if you live or die. The steel is indifferent. The wind is indifferent. Only the gang cares. Historians still argue about the exact number of men who died building the Empire State. The official count is 5, which is remarkably low for a project of that scale. But many believe the number was higher, with secondary deaths from injuries sustained on-site being left off the ledger to keep the project's reputation clean. Personally, I suspect the truth is buried somewhere in the limestone. You look at the sky, and it looks wider and hungrier than it did this morning. The boring USA project is a beautiful beast, but it demands a sacrifice of sweat and, occasionally, soul. As you prepare for the final rivets of the shift, you feel a deep, settling fatigue. This is when gravity is most dangerous, when you're tired and your mind is already at the tavern down the street. I find it relatable that the last 10 minutes of any workday are the longest, but up here, they are also the deadliest. You force yourself to focus on the orange glow of the next rivet. You refuse to look at the street. You refuse to think about the what-ifs. I've always felt that the ironworkers were like sailors on a ship that was constantly sinking upward. You're always one step away from the end, but you keep walking because that's the job. The boring USA doesn't have room for cowards, and it certainly doesn't have room for nets. You grip the cold steel of the beam, feeling its solidity, and nod to the heater. One more toss, one more catch, one more day cheated. The sun is almost gone, and the building seems to hum with a dark, heavy energy. Gravity is still pulling, patient as ever. But for today, you've won. Personally, I think every ironworker who makes it back to the ground at 5 p.m. should get a ticker tape parade, but they'll settle for a hot meal and a soft bed. You begin the long, careful descent, leaving the threat of the sky behind you until the whistle blows again tomorrow. As the race for the sky nears its climax, you find yourself caught in the middle of a secret operation involving the most famous needle in history. While the Empire State is rising with brute force, the Chrysler Building is playing a much more cunning game. Personally, I've always loved a good architectural heist, and in 1929, you are part of the team assisting in the clandestine assembly of the Chrysler's secret spire. You see, the skyscraper race isn't just about who can rivet faster, it's about who can lie better. Walter Chrysler was terrified that the Bank of Manhattan building at 40 Wall Street would steal his crown, so he ordered a 185-foot spire to be built inside the building's fire towers, hidden from the prying eyes of the public and the competing contractors. It's a mainstream historical fact that the spire, known as the vertex, was assembled in sections in the dark, cramped elevator shafts of the top floors. You are there, squeezed into a space that smells of hot grease and cold iron, helping to bolt together the shining Neros steel plates. I find it deeply relatable that even in this grand era of progress, the most critical move was made in a dark room where no one could see. A quirky tidbit of the secret spire is that the workers had to be sworn to absolute secrecy. If a single newspaper reporter had found out that a massive needle was being pre-assembled inside the crown, the rival building could have simply added a few more floors of masonry to compensate. Historians still argue whether this was a stroke of genius or a childish move that nearly bankrupted the project. But for you, it's just another set of rivets to drive in a very tight spot. I think the most fascinating thing about working on the Chrysler's secret weapon is the material itself. Unlike the dull, rusted orange of the Empire State's girders, the Chrysler spire is clad in Enduro Ka2 stainless steel. It's a German alloy that doesn't rust and shines like a mirror even on a cloudy day. Personally, I suspect that riveting this stuff was a nightmare because the glare from the sun would bounce off the polished metal and blind you. You're working in the V of the building's famous sunburst arches, looking through the triangular windows that make the building look like a futuristic helmet. I find it relatable that even when you're making history, you're mostly just annoyed that the sun is in your eyes and you can't find your favorite wrench. The atmosphere in the secret spire gang is electric. You aren't just laborers, you're the ninjas of the NYC skyline. On October 23, 1929, the order comes down to hoist the needle. It took only 90 minutes. I've always thought that was the most cinematic moment of the decade. This massive, gleaming spire suddenly erupting from the top of the building like a silver tooth, catching the rival building completely off guard. Historians still argue whether the Bank of Manhattan team felt cheated, but by the time they looked up from their blueprints, the Chrysler was already 1,046 feet tall, the first structure to ever surpass the Eiffel Tower. I find it fascinating that the spire was actually quite light, relatively speaking. It was a hollow latticed structure, which I find relatable because it's the ultimate work smarter, not harder, move. You spent weeks riveting the base, and then in less time than it takes to watch a movie, you were standing on the tallest point on the planet. Personally, I'd be bragging about it to every person in every speakeasy for the next 20 years. A quirky tidbit is that the architect, William Van Allen, actually hid a small time capsule inside the very tip of the spire, containing blueprints and coins, a message to a future that he assumed would still be building things out of steel and rivets. Working on the Chrysler Spire felt different than the Empire State. The Empire State was a machine, but the Chrysler was a piece of jewelry. I think the most authentic part of the experience was the transition from the rough-and-tumble ironwork of the lower floors to the fine, delicate finish of the crown. You had to be careful not to scratch the stainless steel with your tongs. I find it relatable that even roughnecks can have a gentle touch when the material demands it. You were literally polishing the face of New York. As you tightened the last bolts on the spire's base, you could see the Bank of Manhattan building far below. They were still adding a flagpole, unaware they had already lost. I've always felt that the boring USA loves a winner, but it loves a trickster even more. The Chrysler Spire was the ultimate prank. Personally, I think it's the most beautiful building in the world because of that secret history. You aren't just a builder, you're a co-conspirator in a vertical heist. I find it fascinating that the workers who built the spire were given commemorative medals by Walter Chrysler himself. It's a rare moment where the anonymous laborer was given a face and a name. Historians still argue whether these gestures were genuine appreciation or just a way to ensure the men didn't talk before the spire was up. Regardless, you carry that medal in your pocket like a talisman. It's proof that you were there when the skyline changed in 90 minutes. The wind inside the spire's hollow cone has a haunting musical whistle. It's a sound that nobody else on Earth will ever hear quite like you do. I think the most authentic part of this section of the job was the silence that followed the hoist. After weeks of secret hammering, the needle was finally still, piercing the clouds. You sat in the shadow of the stainless steel, looking out at a city that was suddenly smaller than it was yesterday. Personally, I find a lot of peace in that thought, that the most dramatic changes often come from the quietest, most hidden efforts. As the shift ends, you look up at the spire. It's so high that the base is in shadow, while the tip is still glowing with the last rays of the sun. It's a needle of light pointing toward the future. You realize that you've helped build something that isn't just a building. It's an icon of the human ego, at its most brilliant and most secretive. The boring USA is finally reaching its peak, and you're the one who tightened the final rivet. The year 1930 is drawing to a close, and with it, the feverish, clanging era of the great skyscraper race begins to cool. You are standing on the very last tier of the Empire State Building, watching the final rivets being driven into the mooring mast. Personally, I've always found it a bit melancholic to watch a project of this scale reach its end. It's like finishing a massive book and realizing you have to return to the real world. The skyline you've spent months or years shaping is no longer a skeleton. It's becoming a city of stone, glass, and shadow. It's a mainstream historical fact that by the time the Empire State Building was dedicated in May 1931, the economic Roaring Twenties had long since crashed into the Great Depression, leaving many of these vertical cathedrals standing as silent, half-empty monuments to an optimism that the country could no longer afford. I think the most relatable thing about this final stage is the cool down. After months of living in a 2,000-degree world of flaming baseballs and screaming pneumatic hammers, the silence of the finished steel feels heavy. You watch the heater extinguish his forge for the last time. The glowing orange embers fading into gray ash that the wind whisks away over the Atlantic. Historians still argue whether the end of the riveting era marked the death of the roughneck as a legendary figure, or if the workers simply transitioned into the less dramatic world of maintenance and welding. I find it authentic in a quiet, rugged way. You've built a mountain, and now you have to walk back down into the valley. A quirky tidbit of the final stamp is that the very last rivet of the Empire State Building was reportedly made of solid gold, though, like most construction myths, it was actually just a gold-plated steel rivet that was quickly replaced by a standard one once the cameras stopped flashing. I've always felt that the boring USA has a funny way of trying to dress up its hard work with a bit of tinsel at the end. But for you, the gold doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling of the steel under your boots. You've walked across every floor of this giant. You know the exact spot where a derrick cable left a scar on a column. And you remember the specific rivet that almost got away from you during a sudden thunderstorm. I find it fascinating that the mooring mast you're standing on was originally intended to be a dock for transatlantic zeppelins, a futuristic dream that turned out to be a terrifyingly impractical logistical nightmare. Personally, I suspect the architects just wanted an excuse to add another 200 feet to the building's height. Historians still argue whether the Zeppelin dock was a genuine plan or a clever ruse to win the skyscraper race against the Chrysler Building. Regardless, you are standing at the highest point a human can reach in New York, and for a moment, the world is perfectly still. The boring USA is far below you, its problems muted by the altitude. I think the most authentic part of this legacy is the ironworker's stare. You look out over the city you've built, and you don't see a postcard. You see a lattice of human effort. You see the Mohawk brothers, the Irish immigrants, and the Brooklyn kids who all shared this abyss with you. I find it relatable that despite the competition and the danger, the final feeling is one of profound brotherhood. You realize that while your names won't be on the brass plaque in the lobby, your fingerprints are in every joint of the building's spine. Personally, I've always thought that a building's soul isn't in its lobby, but in the rivets that hold it together. As the sun sets on this final section of our journey, the wind begins to soften. The city lights are flickering on, thousands of tiny sparks marking the streets where people are heading home to dinner. You take a final look at your tin lunch pail, now dented and worn. I've always felt that the 1920s skyscraper was the last great handmade object of the industrial age. Every rivet was touched by fire, thrown by hand, and hammered by muscle. The boring USA was a place of monumental scale, but it was built by men who measured their success one flaming baseball at a time. You begin your final descent. The stairs are now enclosed in stone, and the wind is just a distant whistle outside the thick windows. I find it relatable that as you get closer to the ground, you feel the weight of the world returning to your shoulders. The vertigo is gone, replaced by the mundane reality of rent, groceries, and a quiet night's sleep. But you'll always have the sky. You'll always know what it felt like to stand on a 6-inch beam and watch the world turn beneath you. I think the most beautiful thing about the skyline's silent legacy is that it doesn't need to shout to be heard. The rivets have cooled, the steel has settled, and the buildings have become part of the Earth's new geology. Personally, I find a lot of peace in the thought that these giants will still be standing long after we're gone, a testament to a generation that wasn't afraid to reach for the stars, even if they had to throw flaming metal to get there. The boring USA is finally asleep, and it's time for you to find your own rest. As you step out onto the sidewalk for the last time, you look up. The Empire State Building is glowing in the twilight, its mooring mast piercing the dark blue sky like a needle. You aren't just a pedestrian anymore. You're a builder. You nod to the night watchman, adjust your cap, and disappear into the crowd. The noise of the city is a distant hum now, a soft lullaby for a world that has finally finished its day's work. The air is still now. The great iron hammers have finally found their rest, and the orange glow of the forges has cooled into a soft, silvery twilight. You can feel the heaviness in your limbs, that deep, honest exhaustion that comes from a day spent taming the sky. The city beneath you is no longer a frantic hive. It is a tapestry of soft amber lights, a quiet sea of brick and stone that seems to breathe with a slow, steady rhythm. The wind, once your fierce opponent, has become a gentle whisper, trailing fingers through the steel ribs of the building as if saying goodbye to the day. Let your mind drift away from the heights. Feel yourself descending, slowly and safely, back to the solid, welcoming earth. The vibration of the pneumatic gun is a fading echo, a distant memory that is being replaced by the soft hum of the night. You are safe, you are grounded, and the world you helped build is standing strong around you. The skyscrapers are silent sentinels now, watching over the harbor, their peaks lost in a peaceful, starry haze. Everything is in its place. The rivets are set, the beams are joined, and the horizon is still. Imagine the scent of clean linen and the warmth of a soft blanket waiting for you. The stories of the roughnecks and the flaming baseballs are tucked away now, safe in the archives of the night. There is nothing left to catch, nothing left to build, and nothing left to fear. The sky is vast and kind, and the stars are just tiny, cool sparks that will never fall. Close your eyes. Let the silence of the city wrap around you like a heavy wool coat, and drift into the deep, dreamless peace of the vertical frontier.